The docking bay of Station Zirian Prime buzzed with activity as ships from across the galaxy arrived for the annual Galactic Trade Summit. Sleek vessels with polished hulls reflected the artificial lighting, their crews emerging in pristine uniforms that spoke of wealth and status. Among them walked beings of every conceivable shape and form. The tall, elegant Altarians with their crystalline features, the bulky Gornex traders with their rock-like skin, and the swift Velocians whose movements were almost too quick for the eye to follow. Then, there was Marcus Chun. His ship, the Resilient Dawn, was a battered freighter that had seen better decades. Scorch marks from plasma fire scarred its hull, and patches of different metals showed where emergency repairs had been made in the cold vacuum of space. The ship groaned as it settled into its assigned berth, the landing struts protesting with metallic shrieks that echoed through the bay. Marcus emerged from the airlock, and immediately, conversations around him died to whispers. His spacesuit was a patchwork of repairs, different shades of gray and brown where various sections had been replaced or mended. Duct tape held several joints together, and the helmet's visor bore the cloudy scars of micrometeorite impacts. The life support pack on his back hummed with an irregular rhythm that suggested it was held together more by hope than engineering. A group of Altarian merchants nearby began to laugh, their crystalline voices chiming like broken bells. "Look at that relic," one said in galactic standard, making no effort to lower their voice. "Is that thing even space-worthy? The human must be desperate to show up here in such poverty." The Gornex delegation rumbled their agreement, their massive forms shaking with mirth. "Humans," one growled, the universal translator struggling with their gravelly language. "Always pretending they belong among the civilized races." This one probably scraped together his last credits just to afford the docking fee. Marcus said nothing. He simply walked through the crowd, his worn boots making soft sounds against the metal floor. His stride was steady, unhurried, as if the mockery washing over him was no more concerning than background radiation. He'd heard it all before, on 100 different stations, 1,000 different worlds. The station's administrator, a pompous Velocian named Kesk, approached with obvious reluctance. His sleek form practically vibrated with barely contained speed as he looked Marcus up and down with undisguised disdain. "Human," Kesk said, his voice a rapid flutter that the translator rendered as clipped and condescending. "Your vessel barely meets minimum safety standards. Your docking fee has been increased to account for the additional insurance risk you represent to this facility." Marcus reached into a cargo pocket of his suit and withdrew a credit chip. It was as battered as everything else he owned, the plastic casing cracked and held together with adhesive strips. Kesk's expression grew even more sour as he accepted it. 20% surcharge, the administrator added with obvious pleasure. "For aesthetic violations." The watching crowd found this hilarious. The Altarians' laughter grew sharper, while a delegation of Zephyrian nobles, their gossamer forms rippling with colors that indicated extreme amusement, began to record the interaction for their entertainment feeds. Marcus simply nodded and transferred the additional credits. He had somewhere to be. The main conference hall of Zirian Prime was a marvel of engineering and artistry. Holographic displays showed real-time market data from across the galaxy, while translator nodes ensured that every word was understood by every species present. The great powers of the galaxy had gathered here: the hegemony, the coalition, the Free Traders Union, and dozens of smaller factions. At the center of it all sat the Lupin Confederation, and at their head was Sovereign Alpha Thane Grimjaw, the wolf-like being commanded attention simply by existing. Standing nearly 3 meters tall even when seated, his silver and black fur rippled with each breath. Scars crossed his muzzle, marks of honor from countless battles. His yellow eyes missed nothing as they swept across the assembled delegates. The Lupins were warriors by nature, and their recent expansion had made them the dominant military power in this sector. Their ships were feared across known space, and their ground forces were legendary for their ferocity and tactical brilliance. Most importantly, they were the key to accessing the Kepler trade route, a hyperspace corridor that could cut shipping times by 70%. Every major power wanted that access. As Marcus entered the hall, the whispers and chuckles followed him. His appearance was even more jarring here, surrounded by the finest diplomatic attire that money could buy. Altarian silk that shifted colors with the light, Gornek's ceremonial armor that could stop a plasma blast, Voloshan neural interfaces that sparkled with data streams, and one human in a suit held together with improvised repairs. "By the void," whispered Ambassador Prextan of the hegemony, his tentacles writhing with amusement. Did security let a maintenance worker into the conference? The Zephyrian delegation's colors shifted to deep purples and oranges, their equivalent of hysterical laughter. Even some of the minor powers began to mutter among themselves about the absurdity of allowing such an obviously impoverished representative into such an important gathering. But Marcus had earned his place here through blood, sweat, and more close calls than he cared to count. While others had bought their way to the table with inherited wealth or corporate backing, he had carved out his own small corner of space through pure determination. His little trade route might not look like much compared to the vast commercial empires around him, but it was his, and it connected three systems that no one else had thought worth the effort. That route, however minor, contained something that had recently become very valuable indeed: rare earth elements that were essential for the new generation of hyperdrive cores. The big powers had finally noticed, and now they all wanted what Marcus had spent 15 years building. Sovereign Alpha Grimjaw's ears twitched as Marcus found his assigned seat, predictably, in the back row with the other minor powers. The wolf's keen hearing had picked up every mocking comment, every derisive whisper. His expression remained neutral, but those who knew him well might have noticed the slight narrowing of his eyes. The conference began with the usual pomp and ceremony. Speeches about cooperation and mutual prosperity filled the air, while everyone present calculated how to gain advantage over their competitors. The major powers presented their proposals with elaborate holographic displays and carefully crafted rhetoric. The hegemony offered military protection in exchange for exclusive mining rights. The coalition promised infrastructure development and technological advancement. The Free Traders Union spoke of economic partnership and shared prosperity. When it came time for the minor powers to speak, most offered token statements of support for whatever proposal seemed most likely to succeed. They knew their roles in this game. They were prey species in a room full of predators, and the best they could hope for was to avoid being completely devoured. Finally, Kesk announced, with obvious reluctance and barely contained amusement, the chair recognizes Captain Marcus Chun, representing the independent Meridian trade route. Marcus stood slowly, his suit's joints creaking softly in the sudden silence. He walked to the speaking podium with that same unhurried gait, ignoring the snickers and whispered comments that followed in his wake. "Honored delegates," he began, his voice clear and steady despite the primitive translator built into his suit's collar. "I come before you not as a representative of a great power, but as someone who has spent 15 years learning what it truly means to survive in the void between the stars." The Altarian delegation exchanged glances, their crystalline features reflecting their amusement. Ambassador Prextan's tentacles curled in what passed for a smile among his species. This was going to be entertaining. "You offer protection," Marcus continued, his gaze sweeping across the assembled delegates. "But I have learned to protect myself. You offer prosperity, but I have built my own. You offer the promise of safety, but safety is not given. It is earned." Sovereign Alpha Grimjaw leaned forward slightly, his massive form shifting in his chair. Something in the human's tone had caught his attention, a quality that reminded him of young wolves facing their first hunt, determination mixed with hard-won wisdom. "The Meridian route may seem insignificant to you," Marcus said, his voice growing stronger. "3 small systems, a handful of worlds that most consider barely worth the fuel to reach them. But those worlds have taught me something that I suspect many of you have forgotten." He paused, letting his words sink in before continuing. "They have taught me that survival is not about having the newest ship or the most advanced technology. It's not about inherited wealth or corporate backing. Survival is about adaptation, determination, and the willingness to do whatever it takes to protect what matters to you." The mockery in the room was beginning to fade, replaced by a growing sense of curiosity. Even the Voloshan administrator had stopped his nervous fidgeting to listen. Every one of you wants access to my route because of the rare Earth deposits we've discovered. You see profit margins and strategic advantages. But I see something else entirely. Marcus's voice carried a weight that seemed at odds with his shabby appearance. I see the culmination of 15 years of building something from nothing, of turning barren rocks into thriving communities, of creating hope where none existed before. Ambassador Prextan's tentacles had gone still, and the Zephyrian delegation's colors had shifted to muted blues and greens, their equivalent of respectful attention. The change in the room was palpable. My ship may look like a wreck to you, Marcus continued, but she has carried me through solar storms that would cripple your finest vessels. This suit may seem primitive, but it has kept me alive in situations where your advanced equipment would have failed. And this route you all want so badly? I built it one careful jump at a time, mapping hazards and finding safe passages through regions of space that your navigators marked as too dangerous to attempt. Sovereign Alpha Grimjoy's yellow eyes were now fixed intently on the human speaker. The wolf had spent enough time around warriors to recognize one when he saw it, regardless of how they were dressed. So yes, Marcus said, his voice carrying across the now silent hall. I am just one human with one old ship and a handful of worlds that most of you had never heard of until 6 months ago. But I am also someone who has never given up, never backed down, and never compromised when it came to protecting the people who depend on me. He looked directly at the Sovereign Alpha as he spoke his next words. I learned a long time ago that respect is not given because of what you own or where you come from. Respect is earned through your actions, your character, and your willingness to stand firm when everything around you is falling apart. The hall remained silent for a long moment after Marcus finished speaking. Then, slowly, Sovereign Alpha Grimjaw began to stand. His massive form unfolded like a force of nature, and when he spoke, his voice carried the authority of someone who had led warriors into battle across 100 worlds. Captain Chun, the wolf said, his words carefully measured. Your reputation precedes you, though I suspect few in this room have heard the true stories. His yellow eyes swept across the other delegates, and more than one ambassador suddenly found themselves studying the floor. Would you be willing to share with us exactly how you came to establish this trade route that everyone finds so valuable? Marcus nodded slowly. It's not a particularly glamorous story, your sovereignty. It begins with desperation, involves a lot of stupid risks, and includes more near-death experiences than I care to count. Grimjaw's ears perked forward with interest. Those are often the best kinds of stories, Captain. Please, proceed. And so Marcus began to tell them about the Meridian route, about the first desperate jump into uncharted space with a ship that was already falling apart, about the months spent mapping asteroid fields and solar wind patterns that could tear a vessel to pieces, about the discovery of 3 small worlds whose populations had been written off by the major powers as not worth the cost of regular supply runs. He told them about the pirates who had thought an lone human freighter would be easy prey, and about the corporate raiders who had tried to muscle in once the rare earth deposits were discovered. He spoke matter-of-factly about firefights in asteroid belts, about jury-rigging life support systems with whatever materials were available, about choosing to risk everything rather than abandon the communities that had come to depend on his supply runs. As he spoke, the other delegates began to realize that they were not listening to some desperate nobody who had stumbled into good fortune. They were listening to someone who had carved out his own piece of the galaxy through skill, determination, and sheer bloody-minded refusal to give up. But the most interesting reaction came from Sovereign Alpha Grimjaw himself. The wolf's expression grew increasingly thoughtful as Marcus described battle after battle, crisis after crisis, each one overcome through a combination of tactical thinking and absolute unwillingness to surrender. When Marcus finished his account, the hall remained silent for several long seconds. Then, Grimjaw spoke again, his voice carrying a note of something that might have been approval. Captain Chun, the Sovereign Alpha said slowly. You mentioned that your suit has kept you alive in situations where more advanced equipment would have failed. I confess myself curious about these situations. Marcus hesitated for a moment, then reached up toward his helmet's sealing ring. Perhaps it would be easier to show you your sovereignty. The helmet's clasps released with soft clicks that seemed unnaturally loud in the silent hall. Marcus lifted it off and set it aside, running a hand through his short brown hair before looking up at the assembled delegates. The reaction was immediate and electric. Gasps echoed through the hall as the other delegates saw Marcus's face clearly for the first time. A web of scars crisscrossed his features, telling the story of a life lived on the edge between survival and death. A jagged line ran from his left temple to his jaw, the mark of shrapnel from an exploding control panel. His right cheek bore the puckered circle of a plasma burn, while smaller scars dotted his forehead and chin like a constellation of past struggles. But it was his eyes that commanded attention. They were the pale blue of deep space, and they held a depth of experience that spoke of decisions made in impossible circumstances, of victories snatched from the jaws of defeat, of a man who had looked death in the face more times than anyone should have to and had never blinked first. The mockery was gone now, replaced by something else entirely. Even the Altarians had stopped their crystalline chiming, while the Gornex delegation's rocky features had shifted into expressions of grudging respect. But it was Sovereign Alpha Grimjaw's reaction that would change everything. The great wolf's ears snapped forward, and his yellow eyes widened with what could only be described as recognition. For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, Predator stared at Predator across the conference hall. Then, slowly and deliberately, Sovereign Alpha Thane Grimjaw rose to his full height and performed something that no one in the hall had ever seen before. The formal lupin bow of respect reserved for only the most honored warriors. The massive wolf lowered his great head until his muzzle nearly touched the table before him. His arms spread wide in a gesture that exposed his throat, the ultimate sign of trust and respect among his people. When he raised his head again, his voice carried across the stunned silence of the conference hall. "Warriors of the Void," he said, using a lupin phrase that had no exact translation but conveyed the highest possible honor. "I see the marks of true battle upon you, Captain Marcus Chun. Your scars speak of courage in the face of overwhelming odds, of victory earned through blood and determination. You have fought for your pack." He gestured toward the viewing screen that showed the three worlds of the Meridian route, "and you have prevailed." The conference hall erupted into chaos as delegates tried to process what they had just witnessed. The most powerful military leader in the sector had just shown formal respect to a human most of them had been mocking minutes earlier. Ambassador Prextan's tentacles writhed in confusion. The Zephyrian delegation's colors shifted through rapid sequences that indicated complete bewilderment. Even Kesk had stopped his constant motion, frozen in shock. But Marcus simply nodded to the Sovereign Alpha, his scarred features showing no surprise at the gesture. In that moment, it became clear that he had somehow expected this reaction, or at least he understood its significance in a way that the other delegates did not. "Your sovereignty honors me," Marcus said simply. "I have indeed fought for my pack, and I will continue to do so as long as there is breath in my body." Grimjaw's ears twitched with what might have been amusement. "I suspect, Captain Chun, that there are stories behind those scars that would put our finest war ballads to shame. Perhaps, when this conference concludes, you would honor my pack by sharing them over proper warriors' fare." "It would be my privilege, your sovereignty." The exchange sent shockwaves through the assembled delegates. A formal invitation to dine with the Sovereign Alpha was an honor that the major powers had been trying to secure for months. The fact that it had been offered to a supposedly insignificant human traitor was almost incomprehensible. But as Marcus began to describe the specific encounters that had left their marks on his face and body, a new picture began to emerge. This was not just a lucky human who had stumbled into a profitable trade route. This was a warrior who had earned his place through trial by fire, someone who had proven himself worthy of respect through deeds rather than words. The battle with the Corsair fleet in the Gamma Serpentis system, where Marcus had used an unstable asteroid field as both weapon and shield to defeat 6 ships with his single freighter. The rescue operation at Kepler Station, where he had flown into a collapsing star's gravity well to evacuate 3,000 civilians while corporate security forces fled. The year-long siege of New Meridian, where his supply runs had been the only thing standing between the colonists and starvation, while pirates tried to starve them into submission. Each story revealed new layers of tactical brilliance, desperate courage, and absolute dedication to protecting those who could not protect themselves. And, with each tale, Sovereign Alpha Grimjaw's respect grew more obvious. The other delegates began to realize that they had seriously misjudged the situation. The human they had dismissed as a poverty-stricken nobody was actually something far more dangerous. A proven warrior who had earned the respect of the galaxy's most formidable military leader. As the first session of the conference drew to a close, the balance of power in the room had shifted dramatically. What had begun as a simple competition for access to a minor trade route had become something far more complex. The Lupin Confederation's obvious respect for Marcus Chun had changed the entire equation. Ambassador Prextan approached Marcus as the delegates began to file out of the hall. His tentacles moved in careful patterns that indicated cautious respect mixed with calculation. Captain Chun, the hegemony representative said, his translator giving his words a formal tone. I confess that we may have underestimated the significance of your position in this sector. Perhaps we could discuss, Ambassador, Marcus interrupted gently. I appreciate your interest, but, as I said in my speech, I've learned to be very careful about who I trust with the things that matter to me. The dismissal was polite, but absolute, and Prextan's tentacles curled in frustration as he realized that his earlier mockery had probably cost the hegemony any chance of easy negotiations. Similar scenes played out across the hall as other delegates who had laughed at Marcus's appearance now scrambled to find ways to open diplomatic channels with someone they had badly misjudged. But Marcus was no longer paying attention to them. His focus was entirely on Sovereign Alpha Grimjaw, who was making his way through the crowd with the fluid grace of a natural predator. When the wolf reached Marcus, he extended a massive clawed hand. Until tonight, Captain, Grimjaw said as they shook hands. I look forward to hearing the full stories behind those scars. As the Sovereign Alpha departed, trailed by his retinue of lesser wolves, Marcus was left alone with his thoughts. The first round was over, and he had achieved something that none of the major powers had managed. He had earned genuine respect from the one being whose opinion could make or break any deal in this sector. But he also knew that this was just the beginning. The other delegates would not give up easily, and now that they realized his true worth, they would bring everything they had to bear in their attempts to claim the Meridian route. Marcus picked up his battered helmet and tucked it under his arm. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new attempts to intimidate or bribe or threaten him into submission. But tonight, he would dine with wolves and share the stories of how one human had carved out his own place among the stars. As he walked toward the docking bay, Marcus allowed himself a small smile. Let them come with their threats and their offers and their schemes. He had survived worse than anything they could throw at him. After all, he was Marcus Chun, and he had never learned how to give up. The private dining chamber aboard the Lupin flagship Fenris Ascendant was a study in controlled power. The walls were decorated with battle standards from 100 conquered worlds, each one representing a victory that had expanded the Confederation's territory. The lighting was deliberately kept low, creating pools of shadow that would have made most species uncomfortable. For the Lupins, it was perfect. Their enhanced senses thrived in conditions that would leave others stumbling blind. Marcus entered the chamber wearing the same battered spacesuit he had worn to the conference, though he had made an effort to clean the worst of the grime from its surface. He had considered trying to find something more formal to wear, but had ultimately decided against it. The suit was part of who he was, and if Sovereign Alpha Grimjaw truly respected him, it would be for what he had accomplished while wearing it. The Great Wolf was waiting for him, but he was not alone. 3 other Lupins sat at the massive table, their positions indicating high rank within the pack hierarchy. Marcus recognized Admiral Scarl Bloodfang, the military commander whose tactical brilliance had broken the hegemony's expansion into this sector. Beside him sat General Vera Ironhowl, whose ground forces were legendary for their effectiveness in urban warfare. The third was someone Marcus didn't immediately recognize, a smaller wolf with silver fur and intelligent green eyes who wore no visible rank insignia. Captain Chun, Grimjaw rumbled as Marcus approached the table. Allow me to introduce my pack siblings. You know Admiral Bloodfang, and General Ironhowl by reputation, I'm sure. And this is Dr. Luna Starsight, our chief intelligence analyst and strategic advisor. Marcus bowed slightly to each in turn, a gesture of respect that earned approving nods from the assembled wolves. Your Sovereignty, Admiral, General, Doctor. I'm honored by your invitation. The honor is ours, Captain, Dr. Starsight said, her voice carrying the crisp accent of the Lupin core worlds. Your reputation in certain circles is quite remarkable. As they settled around the table, servitors brought out dishes of traditional Lupin warrior fare. Roasted meats seasoned with spices from a dozen worlds, hearty grain porridges that could sustain a soldier through a long campaign, and fermented beverages that would have knocked most species unconscious. Marcus accepted everything offered to him with good grace, though he was careful to pace himself with the alcohol. So, Captain, Admiral Bloodfang said after they had eaten in companionable silence for a while, Grimjaw tells us you have some interesting scars to show for your years in space. I confess myself curious about the plasma burn on your cheek. That's not the sort of injury you get from a simple pirate raid. Marcus touched the puckered scar reflexively. No, Admiral, it's not. That one came from the Battle of Kepler Station, about 8 years ago. Ah. General Ironhowl leaned forward with interest. The corporate security withdrawal. We heard reports, but the details were unclear. The details were classified by hegemony intelligence, Dr. Starsight added dryly, which usually means they were embarrassing to someone important. Marcus took a sip of his drink, a potent Lupin brew that tasted like liquid fire, and began to tell the story. Kepler Station was a mining platform in orbit around a red giant star. Population of about 3,000, mostly miners and their families. The star was in the final stages of collapse, but the corporate projections said they had at least another 6 months before it became too dangerous to operate. He paused, his pale eyes growing distant with memory. The projections were wrong. The star went unstable 3 months early, and when it started throwing off massive solar flares, the corporate security forces abandoned the station. Just left. 3,000 people trapped in a metal can while the star they were orbiting turned into a cosmic blowtorch. Grimjaw's ears flicked forward. And you were in the area when this happened? I was making a supply run to one of the outer mining asteroids. When I picked up the distress signals, I was already inside the star's gravity well. Marcus's voice remained steady, matter-of-fact, as if he were describing a routine cargo delivery rather than a desperate rescue mission. The radiation levels were already climbing past safe limits, and they were getting worse by the hour. Corporate policy in such situations is to write off the losses and file insurance claims, Dr. Starsight observed, her tone carefully neutral. I'm not corporate, Marcus said simply. Admiral Bloodfang's eyes gleamed with appreciation. So you went in after them. The resilient Dawn wasn't designed for that kind of radiation environment, but she'd been modified over the years. Reinforced shielding, redundant life support systems, emergency cooling units that could handle extreme thermal stress. Even so, it was going to be a near thing. Marcus set down his drink and pulled up the sleeve of his suit, revealing a complex pattern of scars on his forearm that looked like branching lightning. Radiation burns from overloaded control circuits. The EMP from the solar flares kept frying our electronics faster than I could replace them. I ended up having to reroute half the ship's systems through manual backups that were never designed to handle that kind of load. General Ironhowl studied the scars with professional interest. Those are severe. You should have died from that level of exposure. Probably should have, Marcus agreed. But I had medpacks with radiation scrubbers, and, more importantly, I had a reason to stay conscious long enough to finish the job. How many trips did it take? Grimjaw asked, though his tone suggested he already suspected the answer would be impressive. 17. The station's escape pods had been damaged in the first wave of flares, so I could only take about 200 people per trip in the cargo hold. Rough ride, but better than staying behind to get cooked. Dr. Starsight's green eyes narrowed as she performed rapid calculations in her head. 17 trips into an increasingly unstable stellar environment. The radiation exposure alone should have killed you by the third run. Like I said, I had medical supplies and a very good reason to keep going. Marcus's voice carried a note of something that might have been pain. On the fourth trip, I picked up a family, parents, and 2 young children. The little girl, maybe 7 years old, asked me if I was going to come back for everyone else. When I told her yes, she said, "Promise?" So I promised. The table fell silent. Among Lupins, promises made to pups were considered sacred, binding beyond death itself. The fact that Marcus had risked everything to keep a promise made to a human child said more about his character than any military decoration could have. The plasma burn? Admiral Bloodfong prompted gently. Trip number 12. A massive flare hit while I was docking with the station. The electromagnetic pulse overloaded the docking clamp controls and caused a power feedback through the manual coupling. The control panel exploded about 2 inches from my face. Marcus touched the scar again. I was lucky it was just superficial burns. If I'd been looking directly at it, you would have lost your eyes, General Ironhowl finished. But you kept going. I kept going. By trip 15, the star was throwing off so much radiation that the Dawn's shielding was starting to fail. I was flying on manual controls because the computers couldn't handle the interference, and the life support was cycling between operational and emergency backup every few minutes. Grimjaw leaned back in his chair, his massive form relaxed, but his eyes intent. What happened on the final trips? The station was breaking apart. The artificial gravity was fluctuating, and several sections had already been sealed off due to hull breaches. The remaining survivors, about 400 people, were crowded into the central core where the shielding was strongest. But even that wasn't going to protect them much longer. Marcus took another sip of his drink, using the pause to organize his thoughts. The problem was weight. 400 people was more than the Dawn could handle in normal circumstances. And these weren't normal circumstances. The extra mass would slow down our escape velocity, which meant spending more time in the gravity well while the star tried to kill us. So what did you do? Dr. Starsight asked, though her tone suggested she was beginning to understand the scope of what they were hearing. I stripped everything non-essential from the ship. Life support equipment, cargo handling systems, even some of the hull plating from the areas that weren't critical for atmospheric integrity. If it wasn't absolutely necessary for getting us out of that gravity well alive, it got jettisoned. Admiral Bloodfang's ears twitched with what might have been admiration. You turned your ship into a flying lifeboat. Pretty much. And even then, it wasn't going to be enough. The star was building toward a massive coronal mass ejection, something that would have fried everything in the system. We had maybe 20 minutes before it hit. But you got them out, Grimjaw said. It wasn't a question. I got them out. Barely. The CME hit us about 30 seconds after we cleared the gravity well, but by then, we had enough distance to ride it out instead of being destroyed by it. The electromagnetic pulse fried what was left of our electronics, but the Dawn's hull held together long enough for a hegemony rescue ship to find us. General Ironhowl shook her head slowly. 3,000 people. You saved 3,000 people. I kept a promise, Marcus corrected quietly. The silence that followed was different from before, not the absence of sound, but a moment of respect that needed no words. Finally, Dr. Starsight spoke. The hegemony classified the reports from that incident, she said, her voice carrying a note of disgust. Corporate embarrassment over their security forces abandoning their own people. As far as the official records show, the evacuation was carried out by unidentified merchant vessels with minimal casualties. I didn't do it for recognition, Marcus said simply. No, Grimjaw agreed. You did it because it was the right thing to do, which is exactly why it deserves recognition. The Sovereign Alpha rose from his chair, and the others immediately followed suit. Marcus started to stand as well, but Grimjaw gestured for him to remain seated. Captain Marcus Chun, the Great Wolf, said formally, by the ancient laws of our people, I name you Corvainthal, Pack-Brother of the Void. You have shown courage in battle, wisdom in crisis, and loyalty to those who depend upon you. You have proven yourself worthy of trust in the deepest dark between the stars. The significance of what was happening hit Marcus like a physical blow. Corvainthal was not just an honorary title. It was formal adoption into the Lupin Pack structure. It meant that as far as the Confederation was concerned, he was family. Dr. Starsight stepped forward, producing a small device from her robes. If you accept this honor, Captain, it comes with both privileges and responsibilities. You will have the protection of the pack, but You will also be expected to defend your pack siblings when the need arises. Marcus looked around the table at the faces watching him. Admiral Bloodfang with his scarred muzzle and knowing eyes. General Ironhowl with her stern expression softened by approval. Dr. Starsight with her analytical gaze now showing something that might have been warmth. And Sovereign Alpha Grimjaw himself, the most powerful military leader in the sector, offering him a place at the table as an equal. I accept, Marcus said, rising to his feet. And I swear by the void between stars that I will honor this trust. The device Dr. Starsight held projected a holographic display, a complex genealogical chart that showed the pack relationships within the Lupin Confederation. As they watched, a new line appeared, connecting Marcus's name to the royal bloodline itself. He was now, in the eyes of Lupin law, a member of the Sovereign Alpha's immediate family. There will be a formal ceremony when we return to the homeworld, Grimjaw explained. But for now, this recognition is sufficient for all legal and military purposes. His yellow eyes gleamed with something that might have been amusement. I suspect this will come as quite a shock to your fellow conference delegates. Admiral Bloodfang raised his drinking horn in a toast. To our new pack brother, who flies alone into the dark and brings back the lost. The others joined the toast, and Marcus found himself drinking a warrior's salute with some of the most dangerous beings in the galaxy. The irony was not lost on him. A few hours ago, other delegates had been mocking his appearance, and now he was sitting at the high table of the Lupin Confederation. There is something else, Dr. Starsight said as they settled back into their chairs. Now that you are pack family, there are certain intelligence briefings you're entitled to receive. Information that might be relevant to your current situation. Marcus raised an eyebrow. What kind of information? The kind that explains why everyone is suddenly so interested in your little trade route, Grimjaw replied. Tell me, Captain, how much do you know about the rare earth elements you've been mining? Enough to know they're valuable. High concentrations of lanthanides and actinides, some isotopes that are particularly useful for hyperdrive construction. But the deposits aren't that large, maybe enough to supply a few hundred ships per year. Dr. Starsight and Admiral Bloodfang exchanged glances. Captain, the Admiral said carefully, how familiar are you with Project Starbridge? Marcus frowned. The name was vaguely familiar, something he'd heard mentioned in intelligence chatter from the major powers, but the details had always been classified above his clearance level. Not very, he admitted. Some kind of hegemony research project, I think. Joint research project, Dr. Starsight corrected. Hegemony, coalition, free traders union, and half a dozen smaller powers all contributing resources and expertise. They've been trying to develop a new type of hyperdrive, something that could cut travel times by 90% instead of the current best of 70%. The problem, Admiral Bloodfang continued, is that the new drives require a very specific type of fuel, a crystalline matrix made from isotopes that are incredibly rare. Until recently, there was only one known source in the galaxy, and it was controlled by the hegemony. Marcus felt a cold certainty settling in his stomach. Let me guess. The isotopes they need are exactly the ones we've been finding in the Meridian systems. Not exactly, Grimjaw said with grim amusement. What you've been finding is 10 times more concentrated than anything the hegemony has access to, and it exists in a natural crystalline form that doesn't require expensive processing. In other words, Captain, your little trade route isn't just valuable. It's the key to the next generation of galactic commerce. The full scope of his situation began to dawn on Marcus. No wonder every major power had sent representatives to this conference. No wonder they had been willing to tolerate his presence despite their obvious disdain for his appearance. The Meridian route wasn't just a minor trade corridor. It was potentially the most important strategic asset in the galaxy. How long have you known? He asked quietly. We suspected for several months, Dr. Starsight replied. But we only confirmed it recently. The question now is what you intend to do with this knowledge. Marcus was quiet for a long moment, thinking through the implications. With the right negotiations, he could become one of the wealthiest beings in the galaxy. The major powers would bid against each other for exclusive access, and the numbers would be astronomical. But wealth had never been what motivated him. The colonies in the Meridian systems depended on him, not just for rare earth exports, but for everything that made their lives possible. Food, medical supplies, manufactured goods, communication with the outside galaxy. All of it flowed through his ships and his supply networks. The same thing I've always intended to do, he said finally. Protect my people and keep my promises. Grimjaw's ears perked forward with interest. Even if it means turning down offers that could make you richer than most planetary governments? Especially then, Marcus replied. I've seen what happens when people prioritize profit over responsibility. I've seen colonies abandoned when they stop being profitable enough, supply routes cut off because the margins weren't high enough, emergency aid denied because the recipients couldn't afford to pay for it. He looked around the table, meeting each pair of eyes in turn. The people in the Meridian systems trust me. They've built their lives around the promise that I'll be there when they need me. I'm not going to betray that trust for any amount of money. General Ironhowl leaned back in her chair, an expression of satisfaction crossing her features. That is exactly what I hoped you would say. Why? Marcus asked, though he was beginning to suspect he knew the answer. Because, Sovereign Alpha Grimjaw said with a predatory smile, we have a proposition for you. One that will let you protect your people, honor your promises, and give the major powers something to think about for the next few centuries. Dr. Starsight activated another holographic display, this one showing a detailed map of the local galactic region. The Meridian route appeared as a small cluster of systems on the edge of Lupin space, surrounded by the much larger territories of the Hegemony, Coalition, and Free Traders Union. The Lupin Confederation has been watching the expansion of the major powers with growing concern, she explained. They're consuming smaller nations and independent systems at an alarming rate. Within 50 years, everything in this sector will be controlled by one of 3 megastates. Unless, Admiral Bloodfong added, there are enough independent systems to form a viable alternative. A confederation of smaller powers that can stand together against the giants. Marcus studied the map, his tactical mind already seeing the possibilities. You're talking about creating a buffer zone. Independent systems that can defend themselves collectively, but maintain their individual sovereignty. Exactly, Grimjaw confirmed. And the Meridian route would be the perfect foundation for such an alliance. Your people already trust you, your systems are economically viable, and now you have the most valuable resource in the galaxy. Plus, General Ironhowl added with a grin that showed far too many teeth, you would have the Lupin Confederation as an ally and trading partner. Our military protection in exchange for preferred access to your rare earth deposits. It was a tempting offer, more than tempting. Alliance with the Lupins would give the Meridian systems the protection they needed to remain independent, while the rare earth exports would provide the economic foundation for growth and prosperity. But Marcus had learned to be suspicious of offers that seemed too good to be true, even when they came from beings he was beginning to trust. What's the catch? He asked bluntly. Dr. Starsight's ears twitched with what might have been amusement. The catch is that the major powers are not going to accept this gracefully. When they realize what you represent, not just a source of rare earths, but the foundation of a new political bloc that could challenge their hegemony, they're going to bring everything they have to bear against you. Military pressure, economic warfare, diplomatic isolation, covert operations, Admiral Bloodfong enumerated grimly. They'll try to destabilize your systems from within, corrupt your subordinates, assassinate key leaders. Anything to break your alliance before it becomes strong enough to threaten their expansion plans. In other words, Grimjaw said with characteristic directness, accepting our offer means declaring war on 3 of the most powerful entities in the galaxy. They won't call it war, of course. They'll use words like police action and peacekeeping mission and humanitarian intervention. But the end result will be the same. They'll try to destroy everything you've built. Marcus absorbed this information without visible reaction. He had expected something like this, had known from the moment he saw the other delegates' faces that his little trade route was going to become a battlefield whether he wanted it or not. How long do I have to decide? He asked. The conference ends in 3 days, Dr. Starsight replied. After that, everyone goes back to their home systems to prepare whatever strategies they've decided upon. If you're going to accept our alliance, it needs to be before then. And if I refuse? Grimjaw's expression grew sad. Then, you'll face what's coming alone. We'll honor our personal friendship, of course, and you'll always have a place in our pack. But politically, militarily, economically, you'll be on your own against entities that have resources you can't even imagine. Marcus nodded slowly. It was about what he had expected, but having it laid out so starkly was still sobering. 3 days to make a decision that would determine the fate of everyone who depended on him. I need to think about this, he said finally. And I need to talk to my people. This isn't just my decision to make. Of course, Grimjaw agreed. But remember, Captain, some decisions can't be made by committee. Sometimes a leader has to choose a path and trust that his people will follow. As the evening wound down, and Marcus prepared to return to his ship, Dr. Starsight handed him a secure communication device. If you decide to accept our offer, or if you need to reach us for any reason, use this. It's encrypted with loop-in military protocols. No one else will be able to intercept or decode the transmissions. Marcus pocketed the device and shook hands with each of his hosts in turn. When he reached Sovereign Alpha Grimjaw, the Great Wolf placed a massive paw on his shoulder. Whatever you decide, Pack Brother, know that it will be the right choice. You've proven your wisdom in battle and your loyalty to those you protect. Trust those instincts. They've served you well so far. As Marcus made his way back to the docking bay where the resilient Dawn waited, his mind was already working through the implications of what he had learned. The next few days were going to determine not just his own future, but the future of everyone in the Meridian systems. Behind him, in the private dining chamber of the Fenris Ascendant, Lupins watched his retreating figure with expressions of thoughtful respect. Think he'll accept? Admiral Bloodfang asked. He'd be a fool not to, General Ironhow replied. But then, again, he'd also be a fool to trust us completely. We're asking him to bet everything on a species he barely knows against powers he's dealt with his entire career. Dr. Starsight activated her datapad, pulling up profiles of the other conference delegates. The Hegemony delegation has already requested a private meeting with him for tomorrow morning. The Coalition and Free Traders Union will follow suit before the day is out. They'll offer him everything they can think of, Grimjaw mused. Wealth, power, protection, technology, anything to avoid losing control of those rare Earths. Will it work? Admiral Bloodfang wondered. Sovereign Alpha Thane Grimjaw thought about the scarred human who had just left his ship, about the stories of desperate rescues and impossible victories, about the quiet determination in those pale blue eyes. No, he said finally. Marcus Chin doesn't make decisions based on what he can gain. He makes them based on what he can protect. And, right now, the only way to protect his people is to make sure they're strong enough to stand on their own. The wolf's yellow eyes gleamed in the dim lighting. Tomorrow, the real negotiations begin. And I suspect our new pack brother is about to remind the galaxy why humans are not to be underestimated. The morning session of the Galactic Trade Summit began with an undercurrent of tension that everyone could feel, but no one openly acknowledged. Word of Marcus's private dinner with the Lupin delegation had spread through the station's gossip networks overnight, and the implications had every major power scrambling to reassess their strategies. Ambassador Prextan of the Hegemony arrived early, his tentacles moving in patterns that indicated barely controlled anxiety. The Coalition's representative, Minister Von Crest, a tall, pale human from the corporate worlds, spent the pre-session period in hushed conversations with his staff. Even the Free Traders Union's delegation seemed less confident than they had the day before. Marcus entered the conference hall exactly on time, still wearing his patched and battered spacesuit. The mockery was gone now, replaced by careful calculation as delegates tried to determine what the scarred human might do next. When he took his seat in the back row, the eyes that followed him were no longer dismissive, they were wary. Sovereign Alpha Grimjaw entered with his usual commanding presence. But Marcus noticed that the wolf's gaze lingered on him for just a moment longer than protocol required. The message was subtle but clear. The Lupin Confederation was watching, waiting to see what choice their new pack brother would make. Administrator Kesk called the session to order with visible nervousness. The Velocian's rapid speech patterns were even more accelerated than usual as he announced the morning's agenda. Individual presentations from the major powers regarding their proposals for the Meridian route. Ambassador Prextan spoke first, and his offer was everything Marcus had expected it would be. The hegemony promised immediate payment of 50 billion credits for exclusive mining rights, followed by annual payments of 10 billion credits in perpetuity. They would provide military protection for all 3 Meridian worlds, construct state-of-the-art orbital defenses, and establish a permanent fleet base in the system. Captain Chun, the hegemony ambassador, said, his tentacles curling in what passed for a respectful bow among his species. This offer represents the largest commercial agreement in galactic history. Your people would want for nothing: advanced medical technology, educational opportunities, luxury goods from across the galaxy. We can guarantee prosperity beyond anything your systems have ever known. The offer was staggering in scope. 50 billion credits was more money than most planetary governments saw in a decade, and the annual payments would turn the Meridian worlds into some of the wealthiest systems in the galaxy. The military protection was equally impressive. Hegemony battle fleets were among the most advanced in known space. But Marcus simply nodded politely and said, "Thank you for your proposal, Ambassador. I'll give it careful consideration." Minister Crest presented the coalition's offer next, and, if anything, it was even more generous. 60 billion credits up front, with annual payments of 12 billion. But the coalition's real strength was in infrastructure development. They promised to build hyperlane networks that would cut travel times to the Meridian systems by 80%, establish major trade hubs that would turn the systems into commercial centers, and provide unlimited access to coalition technology and manufacturing. Captain Chun, Minister Kress, said in his clipped corporate accent, "The coalition believes in partnerships that benefit everyone involved. We're not interested in simply exploiting your resources. We want to help you build something that will last for generations. Your people won't just be wealthy. They'll be educated, connected, and empowered to shape their own destiny within the coalition framework." Again, Marcus thanked the minister and promised to consider the offer carefully. The Free Traders Union took a different approach entirely. Their representative, Captain Sarah Blackwood, a weathered human woman whose own scars spoke of years spent in dangerous space, offered something that the others couldn't: complete independence. "Marcus," she said, using his first name with the easy familiarity of a fellow trader, "we know you didn't build the Meridian route so you could sell it off to the highest bidder. The union's offer is simple. We'll help you defend what you've built, but we won't try to own it. Preferred trading status, mutual defense agreements, and access to our support networks. But the Meridian systems remain sovereign and independent." It was the smallest offer in terms of immediate payment, only 20 billion credits up front, but it came with something the others didn't: the promise that Marcus would retain complete control over his own systems. When the presentations were finished, Administrator Kesk announced a recess to allow Captain Chun to consider his options. The subtext was clear. The major powers expected him to spend the break period in private negotiations, accepting additional incentives and clarifications until one of them secured his agreement. Instead, Marcus stood up and walked to the speaker's podium. "If I may," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the hall's audio systems, "I'd like to respond to these generous offers now." The reaction was immediate. Prextan's tentacles writhed with anticipation, while Minister Crest leaned forward in his seat. Captain Blackwood's expression remained carefully neutral, but Marcus could see the tension in her posture. "I want to thank all of you for your proposals," Marcus began, his pale eyes sweeping across the assembled delegates. "They represent a level of generosity that I never could have imagined when I made my first desperate jump into the Meridian systems 15 years ago." He paused, letting the silence stretch for a moment before continuing. "But I think there's been a fundamental misunderstanding about what the Meridian route actually is." Administrator Kesk's rapid movements slowed to a stop. Even Sovereign Alpha Grimjai's ears perked forward with interest. "You see it as a business opportunity," Marcus said, his voice growing stronger. "A resource to be exploited, a strategic asset to be controlled, a problem to be solved with the right combination of credits and military force. But for me, and for the people who live in those systems, it's something else entirely." He gestured toward the holographic display that still showed the 3 small worlds of the Meridian route. Those aren't just mining operations or strategic waypoints. They're home to families who trusted me enough to build their lives in the middle of nowhere because I promised them they'd be safe. They're communities that grew from nothing because people believed in something bigger than immediate profit. Ambassador Prextan's tentacles began to curl with unease. This wasn't going the way he had expected. Epsilon Meridiani has a population of about 80,000 people, Marcus continued. Most of them are miners and their families. But there's also Dr. Sarah Kim, who runs the only hospital within 3 light years and has saved more lives than I can count. There's engineer Thomas Okafor, who designed the atmospheric processors that turned a dead rock into something that can support human life. There's teacher Maria Santos, who makes sure every child in the system gets an education that prepares them for whatever future they choose. Minister Crest was beginning to look uncomfortable as he realized where this was heading. Gamma Meridiani is smaller, maybe 30,000 people, but it's home to the Kowalski family, who grow food in hydroponic farms that feed both their own world and help supply the other systems. It's home to artist Lu Wei, whose sculptures are made from rare crystals found nowhere else in the galaxy, and remind people that beauty matters even on the frontier. It's home to mechanic Jake Thompson, who can fix anything that breaks and has never charged anyone more than they could afford to pay. Marcus's voice carried a weight of personal connection that resonated through the hall. These weren't statistics to him. They were people he knew by name, people whose lives he had helped shape and who had helped shape his. And Delta Meridiani, the newest settlement, has 15,000 people who came there because they wanted to be part of something special. They wanted to prove that you could build a civilization based on cooperation instead of exploitation, on trust instead of fear, on hope instead of desperation. The hall was completely silent now. Even the Zephyrian delegation had stopped their constant color shifting to listen. So when you offer me 50 billion credits, Marcus said, looking directly at Ambassador Prextan, what you're really asking is whether I'm willing to sell the trust of 125,000 people who believed in me enough to bet their futures on my promises. Prextan's tentacles writhed with obvious discomfort. When you offer to turn my systems into major commercial hubs, he continued, turning to Minister Crest, what you're really proposing is to transform quiet communities into busy transit points where the people who built them become servants in their own homes. Crest's corporate composure was beginning to crack. And when you offer to help me defend what I've built, he said to Captain Blackwood, I have to ask, defend it from whom? Because the only reason it needs defending is that everyone else seems to think it belongs to them. Captain Blackwood nodded slowly, an expression of grudging respect crossing her weathered features. Marcus turned to address the entire assembly. Here's what I think has happened. You've all gotten so focused on the rare earth deposits that you've forgotten something important. Those deposits don't exist in isolation. They exist as part of living communities that have spent 15 years learning how to thrive in conditions that would kill most people. He activated his own holographic display, showing detailed readings from the Meridian systems. The rare earths aren't just lying around on the surface waiting to be scooped up. They exist in complex crystalline matrices that require specialized extraction techniques developed by people who've spent their entire careers learning how to work with these specific geological formations. Dr. Luna Starsight leaned forward in her seat, her analyst's mind immediately grasping the implications. More importantly, Marcus continued, the processing facilities that turn raw or into useful materials are integrated into the life support systems of the colonies themselves. The heat from the refineries powers the atmospheric processors. The byproducts from crystal purification provide nutrients for the hydroponic farms. The electromagnetic fields from the extraction equipment help maintain the planetary magnetic shields that protect the settlements from cosmic radiation. The full scope of what he was describing began to dawn on the assembled delegates. This wasn't just a mining operation that happened to have people living nearby. It was a completely integrated system where resource extraction and human habitation were symbiotically connected. So if you want access to those rare earth deposits, Marcus said with quiet authority, you need the people who know how to extract them safely, how to process them efficiently, and how to do it all without destroying the communities that make the entire operation possible. Administrator Kesk found his voice first. Captain Chun, Surely you're not suggesting that the mining operations couldn't be restructured to operate more efficiently? Marcus's expression grew cold. Administrator, I've seen what happens when outside interests restructure mining operations for efficiency. I've seen colonies turned into company towns where the people who do the actual work become little more than indentured servants. I've seen environments destroyed by extraction methods that prioritize short-term profits over long-term sustainability. I've seen communities broken apart when efficiency experts decide that families and schools and hospitals are non-essential overhead. He looked around the room, meeting as many eyes as he could. The Meridian route works because it was built by people who understood that you can't separate resource extraction from the human cost of that extraction. Every decision we've made has been guided by one principle. The people come first. Ambassador Prextan made one last attempt to salvage his position. Captain Chun, surely you can see that the scale of resources available through Hegemony Partnership would benefit your people far more than continuing with your current, limited operations. Marcus turned to face the Hegemony representative directly. Ambassador, let me tell you about the last time the Hegemony offered to help my people. The hall grew very quiet. Even Sovereign Alpha Grimjaw was listening intently. 8 years ago, when the Kepler station evacuation was happening, your corporate security forces received the same distress signals I did. They were actually closer to the station than I was. They could have been there in half the time it took me to reach the evacuation zone. Prextan's tentacles went very still. Instead, they calculated that a rescue operation wasn't cost-effective given the insurance payouts for civilian casualties. 3,000 people were left to die because saving them wouldn't have generated enough profit to justify the fuel expenditure. The accusation hung in the air like a physical presence. Prextan opened his mouth to respond, but Marcus continued before he could speak. So when you tell me that Hegemony Partnership would benefit my people, what I hear is that you'll take care of them right up until the moment it becomes inconvenient or expensive to do so. And that's not the kind of partnership I'm interested in. Minister Crest tried to distance the coalition from hegemony failures. Captain Chun, the coalition has a very different approach to civilian welfare. Our corporate citizenship programs ensure that, Minister, Marcus interrupted, I've read the coalition's corporate citizenship guidelines. Section 47 states that welfare programs are subject to quarterly budget reviews and can be modified or terminated based on operational efficiency requirements. In other words, you'll take care of my people as long as it doesn't hurt your profit margins. Crest's pale face grew even paler as he realized that Marcus had done his homework. The truth is, Marcus said, addressing the entire assembly, none of your organizations have ever demonstrated that they can be trusted to put human welfare ahead of economic interests when the two come into conflict. And, in frontier mining operations, they come into conflict all the time. Captain Blackwood spoke up from the Free Traders Union delegation. Marcus, what about independence? We're offering to help you maintain control of your own systems. Marcus nodded to her. Sarah, I respect the union, and I know your offer is sincere. But independence guaranteed by someone else isn't really independence, is it? The moment the union's interests diverge from mine, that protection disappears. He turned back to address the entire room. So here's my counteroffer. The Meridian route remains completely independent. We'll continue to extract and process rare earth materials, and we'll sell them on the open market to whoever wants to buy them at fair market prices. Ambassador Prextan's tentacles began writhing again. Captain, you can't seriously expect to defend 3 systems against potential threats without military support from a major power. Marcus smiled, and there was something in that expression that made several delegates shift uncomfortably in their seats. Ambassador, I've been defending those systems for 15 years. Pirates, corporate raiders, mercenary companies, even the occasional training exercise by major power fleets that happen to stray into our territory. We're still here. But, surely, Minister Crest protested, you realize that the strategic value of your resources makes you a target for much larger threats than you've faced before? Minister, Marcus replied calmly, I'm aware that several major powers are considering military action to secure control of the Meridian systems. What I think you need to understand is that such action would be both illegal under galactic law and much more difficult than you might expect. Dr. Starsight's green eyes gleamed with professional interest. She was beginning to suspect that Marcus had more cards to play than anyone realized. The Meridian systems are officially recognized as independent by the Galactic Council, Marcus continued. Military action against them would be an act of war, not a police action or peacekeeping mission. And I think you'll find that there are quite a few council members who would object to the precedent of major powers simply seizing independent systems whenever they contain valuable resources. Administrator Kesk interrupted nervously. Captain Chun, surely you're not threatening military resistance against legitimate. Administrator, Marcus said with quiet authority. There's nothing legitimate about seizing someone else's property by force. And as for military resistance, he paused, letting the silence stretch. Well, let's just say that the Meridian systems have had 15 years to prepare for uninvited guests. The implications of that statement sent a chill through the assembly. Marcus wasn't just talking about defending his systems. He was suggesting that he had been preparing for this possibility for years. Sovereign Alpha Grimjaw chose that moment to speak. Captain Chun, the Great Wolf, said formally, the Lupin Confederation would like to offer a different kind of arrangement. Not partnership, not protection, but simple alliance between equals. Every eye in the room turned to the Sovereign Alpha. This was clearly not part of the planned agenda. The Confederation recognizes the independence and sovereignty of the Meridian systems, Grimjaw continued. We offer mutual defense agreements, trade partnerships at fair market rates, and diplomatic support in galactic forums. In return, we ask for the same consideration from you. Marcus bowed slightly to the wolf. Your sovereignty, the Meridian systems would be honored to consider such an alliance. The reaction from the major powers was immediate and intense. Ambassador Prextan's tentacles writhed with alarm. Minister Crest half rose from his seat. Even Captain Blackwood looked concerned at this development. This is highly irregular. Administrator Kest protested. The conference agenda doesn't include the conference agenda, Sovereign Alpha Grimjaw said with quiet authority, includes consideration of proposals regarding the Meridian route. I have just made such a proposal. Dr. Starsight activated another holographic display, this one showing legal documents. The proposed alliance falls within established galactic law governing mutual defense agreements between sovereign entities. All terms are clearly defined and contain no provisions that would compromise the independence of either party. Marcus studied the displayed terms carefully. It was exactly what Grimjaw had described, an alliance between equals, with no provisions for Lupin control or interference in Meridian internal affairs. I accept, he said simply. The hall erupted in chaos. Ambassador Prextan began speaking rapidly in his native language, his tentacles thrashing with agitation. Minister Crest was conferring urgently with his staff. Captain Blackwood sat back in her chair with an expression of grudging admiration. Administrator Kest called for order, but it took several minutes for the noise to die down. When it finally did, Ambassador Prextan was the first to speak. This is completely unacceptable, the hegemony representative declared. The Meridian systems are too strategically important to be left under the protection of a single alliance. The galactic community has a right to ensure that such valuable resources are properly managed. Marcus turned to face him directly. Ambassador, the galactic community has no rights whatsoever regarding the internal affairs of independent systems. What you're describing is exactly the kind of thinking that led to the corporate wars 50 years ago. The situations are hardly comparable, Minister Crest protested. This is about ensuring galactic stability and prosperity. No, Marcus replied firmly. This is about major powers trying to seize control of resources that don't belong to them. And if you think the Meridian systems are going to submit to that kind of extortion, you've seriously misjudged the situation. Dr. Starsight spoke up from the Lupin delegation. Perhaps it would help if Captain Shin explained exactly what kind of defenses the Meridian systems have prepared. Marcus considered this for a moment, then nodded. Very well. Since there seems to be some confusion about our ability to defend ourselves, let me clarify our position. He activated his own holographic display, showing detailed schematics of the 3 Meridian worlds. But these weren't the simple colony layouts that everyone expected to see. Epsilon Meridiani, Marcus began, is protected by a network of automated defense platforms that use rare earth crystals to generate coherent energy beams. Range, 40,000 kilometers. Power output, sufficient to disable or destroy any ship up to and including heavy cruiser class. The display showed a complex array of installations that clearly weren't civilian mining equipment. Several delegates leaned forward to get a better look. Gamma Meridiani is defended by a different approach, stealth mines using crystalline matrices that are virtually undetectable until they detonate. Any fleet attempting orbital bombardment would find itself flying through a minefield that could cripple or destroy half their ships before they realized what was happening. Ambassador Prextan's tentacles had gone completely still. The hegemony's military planners had assumed they would be dealing with civilian targets defended by, at most, converted merchant ships and improvised weapons. Delta Meridiani, Marcus continued, specializes in electronic warfare. The same rare earth deposits that make the system valuable also make it possible to generate electromagnetic pulses that can disable ship systems at ranges up to 100,000 kilometers. Minister Crest was beginning to look distinctly uncomfortable. Captain Chun, are you saying that you've militarized civilian mining colonies? Minister, Marcus replied calmly. I'm saying that I learned a long time ago that the only way to protect something is to make attacking it more expensive than leaving it alone. The Meridian systems aren't just defended. They're defended by people who have spent 15 years learning how to use their unique environment as a weapon. Admiral Bloodfong, who had been quietly listening to everything, finally spoke. Captain Chun, your defensive preparations are impressive. But surely you realize that a determined assault by major power fleets would eventually overwhelm even the best prepared defenses. Marcus nodded to the Lupin Admiral. You're absolutely right, Admiral. Which is why the real defense of the Meridian systems isn't the weapons platforms, or the mines, or the EMP generators. He paused, looking around the room at the confused faces of the delegates. The real defense, he said quietly, is that attacking us would cost more than any rational government would be willing to pay. Dr. Starsight's ears perked forward with interest. Explain. The rare earth deposits in the Meridian systems exist in very specific crystalline formations, Marcus said. Those formations are incredibly delicate. The kind of precision bombing required to destroy the defensive installations would also destroy the deposits themselves. The full implications of what he was saying began to dawn on the assembly. The very resources that made the Meridian systems valuable also made them impossible to seize by force. Any military action against the systems would have to be carried out with such precision that it would take months to plan and execute, Marcus continued. And during that entire time, we would be destroying the mining infrastructure and scattering the processed materials across dozens of hidden locations. Minister Crest's corporate mind immediately grasped the economic implications. You're saying that attacking you would destroy the very resources the attackers would be trying to capture. Exactly. And even if somehow a perfect military operation succeeded in capturing the systems intact, it would still take years to rebuild the extraction and processing capabilities that would be lost when the current population was displaced. Ambassador Prexton finally found his voice. Captain Chun, surely you're not threatening to destroy valuable resources out of spite. Marcus's expression grew very cold. Ambassador, I'm not threatening anything. I'm simply pointing out the facts of the situation. The Meridian systems work because they were built by people who understand the technology and the environment. Remove those people, and you remove the ability to actually use the resources you're trying to control. He looked around the room, meeting as many eyes as he could. So here's where we stand. The Meridian systems are independent and will remain independent. We're willing to trade with anyone who offers fair prices and respects our sovereignty. We're willing to discuss mutual defense agreements with allies who treat us as equals. But we will not be bought, conquered, or intimidated into surrendering control of our own homes. Sovereign Alpha Grimjaw rose to his full height, his massive form dominating the hall. The Lupin Confederation supports the right of the Meridian systems to self-determination. Any military action against our allies would be considered an act of aggression against the Confederation itself. The threat was unmistakable. The Lupins had just put their considerable military might behind Marcus's defiance of the major powers. Administrator Kesk looked around the room nervously. Perhaps we should take another recess to allow all parties to consider these new developments. I don't think that's necessary, Marcus said calmly. The position of the meridian systems is clear, and I believe thee.